Hi, my name is Aidan. In this screencast, we will extend our ASP.NET 5 NG2 seed project to fetch data from EntityFramework. What we got in front of us is the data controller that mocks up the data in the get method. And if we switch to the browser, we can see that we are fetching these from the controller with an Angular app. So to get started with the EntityFramework, we're going to add a couple of new NuGet packages. We're going to do that in our project.json file. We're going to start by adding the core framework. This actually won't let us store anything in a specific server. So we're going to also add a package to tell it that we want to use Microsoft SQL Server. An alternative would be to store to a SQLite database instead. And we're also going to add something called EntityFramework commands. And we're going to use commands later on to generate the migration schema for a database. And to enable the command, we're going to need to add an if command and tell it that it resides in the EntityFramework commands assembly. So if we save now and restore the NuGet packages, we should be able to come to our startup class and add EntityFramework to our application container. And we also need to tell it that we want to use SQL Server. And before we can add a DBContext, we're going to need to create one. So let's create our DBContext. We're going to call it app DBContext. And it will inherit DBContext. And now we can switch back to the startup file again and tell EntityFramework that that is our application DBContext. We could configure the connection string out here in the startup, but I always like to pair the connection string with the actual DBContext. So in here, we're going to override a method on configuring. And here we will use the options builder and use SQL Server and pass in a connection string. And I'm going to use the local DB that ships with Visual Studio. And the database name, we're going to use a trusted connection. We're also going to allow multiple active result sets. All right, so we should be good. And so here we're going to define a property that will create a table to store our shipments in. So we're going to tell it we want a DB set of shipment, and the table should be named shipments. So now we're almost there. We have designed our app DBContext. We will only have one table named shipments that will contain our shipments. And in a startup file, we have added EntityFramework and SQL Server and the DBContext to the application container, but we still don't have any data. So let's create a Cedar that will seed data for us. We're going to add a new class for that. Let's call it Cedar, which will resolve the app DBContext into its constructor. Store that in a private field and create a public method called ensure seed data. So I picked this up from by watching a course by Sean Wildermuth or Wildermuth. I don't know how he actually pronounces his name, but he has a course on Pluralsight. And in here we're gonna seed the database. But before that, we're going to resolve the Cedar into our configure method. And the last thing we do will be to ensure that we seed our data. But before we can resolve the Cedar into our configure method, we're going to need to add it to our application container. So I'm going to configure it as transient which will give us a new instance each time somebody requests an instance of the Cedar. But we are really just gonna request it once in a configure method, so it doesn't really matter if we add it as a scoped instance or as a transient one. So we switch back to our container now. Let's take the data that we created in our controller and first check if we have any shipments. So if we don't have any shipments, we're gonna want to define our data as we did in the controller. And let's get rid of the IDs and let the database generate that for us. So make sure this formats nicely. All right. And then add this to our context and then save. There is a save changes and a save changes async method. So if we do save changes async, we'll probably want to await this. And if we want to be able to await this call, we're gonna need to mark the method as async. And since this is a void, nobody will be able to await the void. So we're gonna want to return a task. So this is a pointer to Sean, because in his course he actually did this, but then later on in the Cedar, or more specifically in the startup class, even though if you mark this one as await and make the method async, when ASP.NET 5 calls, or when the framework calls into the configure method, it won't be able to await the result from the configure anyways. But it will probably not be an issue, but it's not best practice to have an async method that's void. So my recommendation here is, instead of marking this one as an async, I would prefer if we did something like this instead, to make sure that we are done with all the configuration we want to be finished with before we allow ASP.NET 5 to go on with the configuring of the application. So now that we are calling ensure see data, and let's see, and actually creating data here and saving it, we're gonna want to resolve the context into a controller as well. Store it in a private field and then just return context shipments to list. So this should be everything we need to do. So now let's switch to the command prompt and actually generate migration scripts to create our database. Since we added the ef command, we can type dnxef and run EntityFramework. So we're gonna add our first migration scripts. We're gonna call it initial create. And if we switch back to the studio now, we can see that we have a new folder called migrations, which contains our first migration script, containing the schema and the version on how to migrate up and how to migrate down, and also a snapshot of the database. So we still don't have the database, so let's run one more command, dnxef database update. We can see that I mistyped. So let's switch to our app DBContext. It becomes obvious that we need to add server equals local DB project version 13. So let's hope that this fixes our problem and run update once again. And we successfully applied our initial create migration. So if we use the SQL Server Object Explorer and refresh, we can see that we've created our ASP.NET 5 ng2c database, which just contains a migration history table and our shipments table. But if we take a look in the table and actually view the data, we can see that we haven't seeded the data yet, because we won't do that until we've actually started up the application and called the ensure seed data method. So let's hit F5 and make sure that we seed our data. You can see that we hit our Cedar method and we've successfully fetched data from the database instead. And just to make sure that we aren't cheating here, we can switch to the shipments view, refresh, and we can see that we've populated our data. So that was pretty easy. So in the next screencast, we will add ASP.NET Identity to our application and add users that will be able to sign in to fetch their own shipments instead of just fetching all the shipments from the database.